an example of the Unit 2 essay task. All right, so this is a question from a past paper or an example paper a few years ago. The reading section was all about sports and extreme sports, and it finished with a related essay. So there'll always be a connection between the task at the end and the reading section. So it's a good idea actually to incorporate some of the points, maybe a statistic or a quote from an expert in your final piece of writing. So here's an example we're going to work through. The title is "Rugby is too dangerous to be included in school sports. Write an essay giving your views on sport in schools." Now, the first thing it's worth noticing is that this title doesn't force you to write about rugby. The actual task is write an essay giving your views on sport in schools. So even though there's a quote there that mentions rugby, you don't have to mention rugby in your essay. So do read the question very, very carefully and highlight the instruction. What is it that you've been asked to do? Now, whatever subject you've been given, I strongly recommend that you begin with a positive sentence. Okay, so let's just have a look at what that could look like for our introduction. Okay, so we've got a little green I there. This is our introduction, so the first part of our ideas structure. So our introduction very often can start with a positive sentence. So here's a positive sentence. Rugby, and then this is the appositive part here. Another way of describing rugby is the national sport of Wales, or rugby, comma, a very popular sport, comma, and then finish the sentence. So here the main sentence is rugby is considered by many to be very dangerous, and all we've done is drop in the appositive, this bit in the middle, to tell us something else about rugby. Here that it's the national sport of Wales. And already that gives us more things to say about it. So that's a good example of a positive sentence. Just to make it really clear to you, this bit, the appositive part, could come out and it still makes sense as a sentence. Rugby is considered by many to be very dangerous, but a bit more sophisticated, gives us a bit more to talk about if we include the appositive, another way of describing rugby. Okay, from there we need to consider some of these W questions for our introduction. So the order can be very helpful. I'd encourage you to begin to stick to this order of who, when, where and why. So ask yourself those questions. If we're talking about rugby being quite dangerous, it might be that we're talking about, well, it's quite dangerous for people who've been injured. When can that happen? Well, during matches. Where might that happen? It could happen at school, it could happen playing for clubs. And why is it quite dangerous? Well, you get concussion, you can get broken bones. Okay. Those are just some ways of answering those questions though. Plenty of other alternatives. So what I now want you to do is have a go at turning those into sentences, so the remainder of your introduction. So rather than just notes, people who've been injured during matches, try and turn them into a series of sentences that will then complete your introduction. Okay? When you're ready, just press pause and have a go at completing your introduction. Okay, and here's what that might look like. So we've all heard stories of friends in school or even professional players getting injured. So that's the who part. When? This might be during PE lessons, practice games, or even in tournaments. That's when it can happen. Where? It could be while at school, playing for clubs, or even for your country. Why? Among the most common injuries are concussion and broken bones. So that is our introduction almost finished. But I want you to add one more sentence. I want you to finish with a question. So think about what we've said here and finish with a relevant question. Here's one you might want to ask. Does this mean it should be banned? So that question is related to your title. Okay. Really good idea to finish your introduction with a question, because then really what you're going on to do is answer it. So that's I, the I part of our ideas structure, the I for introduction. Next up is the D, which stands for developed point. Okay, now with the developed point, this is going to be your big paragraph. This is going to be your biggest section. Okay, so you've got a few options here. You can make it about your personal opinion, because obviously you've probably going to have the most to say about what you believe in yourself. Or you can make it about the most important issue, the one that most is talked about. Or, especially if considering you've been reading about this topic in the reading section of the exam, it might be the point you've got the most evidence about. So the point that is mentioned the most in the reading section. Okay, either way, the developed paragraph is one that you can begin with an ly word. So personally, comma, primarily, comma, or evidently, comma. Okay, again, when you're ready, just press pause and have a go at writing up your developed point. And now here's what that might look like. Okay, so actually here, the most important issue is like physical contact, isn't it? And the fact that people are hitting each other all the time in rugby. So primarily, the issue with rugby is the amount of physical contact that is part of the game. Then we'd really develop that. So that's why it's the develop point. Rugby relies on hard hits and huge amounts of bravery. So when two players collide at speed, there are inevitably injuries from time to time. Trying to think of examples, so that's how I'm developing my point. In scrums, there is a chance of the whole set piece collapsing and causing back injuries, while the act of tackling can easily leave one or both players involved hurt or bleeding. Right, now I'm going to bring in the personally at the end. Personally, I hated being forced to play rugby at school when I would much rather have been kicking a football. But overall, I firmly believe that it would be wrong to ban the game on those grounds. Okay, so my develop point is actually, look, there are issues with it, but no, let's not ban it. Then that leads quite nicely onto examining the other side. So I'm saying that you shouldn't ban rugby, but what would people who are in favour of a ban say? Start your next section with a phrase like, others might argue, comma, or some would claim that, and then explain what the people who disagree with you would say. Okay, when you're ready, press pause and have a go at that. Okay, here's what that might look like. Others might argue that the growing number of concussions that we see and the improved awareness of head injuries means that rugby's time has come. So they'd ban it based on the number of concussions and what we now know about head injuries. But we're not changing our mind, okay? It's important that we don't just completely contradict what we said in our developed paragraph up here. So what's important next is you dismiss the people who argue with you using the word however. So your next sentence is going to begin with however, and you're going to explain why they're wrong, why rugby's time hasn't come. Okay, press pause and have a go. Here's what that might look like, and notice that this really is sort of dismissing the opposing argument. It's examining the other side, but then dismissing it. So, however, these type of injuries most often occur in international professional rugby, where the level of contact is much higher. I would argue that the greater danger to school children is from obesity and lack of exercise. Banning popular sports like rugby would only encourage more people to stay inside on their Xbox or other console. Okay, so I've kept with the line of argument that rugby should not be banned. That's the E part, so we're up to IDE. Next up is A, which stands for an anecdote or short story. So do you know, or could you make up a little story about rugby and injuries in rugby? Try and start with a time phrase like only the other day or at the weekend. Okay, and if you're really stuck, you can use something from the reading section of the exam and turn it into a little story. Have a go. Could look something like this. So with the Six Nations just taking place, at the weekend we saw just how exciting and inspirational rugby can be for the whole nation. Young, skillful players such as Lou Rees-Summit encouraged us all to be fit, positive and to push ourselves. He represents exactly the type of role model we need, and without rugby he would not be on our TV screens. So here's our time phrase, at the weekend. Okay, and it doesn't even have to be this is not really a story, it's just something that happened. Okay, he was on TV. So it might be something you read, something you saw. Try and turn it into a little anecdote. That's likely to be our shortest paragraph. Okay, this one's only 3 sentences long. That's plenty. So we've gone through our idea, finishing with A. Now we're on to ideas, the summary. So finish with a summing up and try and include one thing you'd like to see happen. So rather than just kind of fading out with your summary, try and include one killer point. Okay, you can start with a time phrase like ultimately, or a concluding phrase like in conclusion or to summarize. Okay, see what you can come up with. Here's what that looks like. Okay, so ultimately, at the end of the day, there are very few sports with no risk attached. For a proud rugby nation like Wales, removing it from school sports would be a disaster. Rather than this extreme reaction, it's important to focus on making the sport as safe as possible. Okay, so one thing I'd like to see happen is using head injury assessments and timeouts. These steps, now a key part of club rugby, need to be embraced in schools too. So I'm finishing with something I'd like to see changed, an action. All right, so that's a talk through the ideas structure. All I would do if I were you is just go back and come up with a different quote about a different topic, okay, or work through the practice papers that we've given you. All right, good luck.